Probably one of the most important things I'd like you to get out of this presentation today is that prevention is the most important part of the wildlife prevention and control of damage. So just remember that too often people don't do anything until they've got a problem, and generally that problem means the damage has already occurred, and in some cases it means it's too late to implement some prevention programs. So you want to be able to think about that all the time. As I said, it's the most important. The prevention can keep the damage from occurring to start with, and if you're in a situation where you have had problems in the past, there's really no reason not to assume you're going to have these problems again in the future. In many cases, it'll save you a lot of time and money and frustrations and headaches just because you've taken the time to do something. A lot of times people don't get involved with the prevention because they don't actually see the results because they didn't have a problem to start with. And the only way they can see the results is if they did have a problem beforehand. And I have to say that when we're dealing with some animals where exclusion, let's say, is the way to solve the problem, prevention is the only way that we can address the situation. So we need to plan ahead of time, sometimes weeks or months before, and sometimes we actually have to conduct the work before the problem actually occurs. One thing we always need to keep in the back of our mind is we're not just killing gophers, we're not just killing animals. We know that all wildlife have a place in the environment. All wildlife do some things that are part of the balance of the nature, the environment, the situation that they're living in. And so we shouldn't just needlessly destroy them. Likewise, we should always recognize the positive role they play so that as we do our control, we can make the decisions necessary to keep them playing that positive role if possible. And the other thing is, many times we just keep wanting to remove animals, and it's an endless proposition, when if we tried to understand them a little bit more, we might find out ways that they can be around and not pose the problems that they have. And I'll be addressing that for almost every species that we talk about. When you're planning wildlife damage control strategies, though, especially as an agency person or university educator, there's a lot of things that we need to recognize and make sure people understand. The local and state laws can be very complicated, but they can be very important, because the last thing we want to do is have someone get in trouble for doing something that they didn't know they weren't supposed to do. And local here is a very important thing to remember, because the local controls, local laws sometimes are drastically different than what the state allows, quite often much more restrictive, and so we need to address those. Things as simple as not shooting in town can get somebody in a lot of trouble, and the state law might say, well, it's perfectly okay to shoot these ground squirrels, and so you need to make sure people are aware of that. We also have other things to be concerned about. Most universities or agencies have some kind of a committee that addresses the euthanasia or the killing of animals. Believe it or not, these can be an important thing to address. Several years ago, when the Extension Wildlife Specialists across the country conducted or put together a handbook, it ended up having to go through a university committee, and we ran into some problems when we were talking about, well, like drowning skunks, because that was not an approved method of euthanasia, and we had to address that in a different way. So at any rate, just make sure that if you put together some kind of a publication or even a news release, that you make sure you're not doing something outside what your university or agency would recommend. Obviously, licenses and certifications are very important. Some of the toxicants that we're going to talk about require restricted use pesticide certification, but there's also some certifications and certainly licenses necessary with other types of control. And along with this, we should be talking about licenses, certifications, and permits, because quite often these animals, just to harass them, to scare them away, is illegal unless you get a permit from the appropriate agencies to do that. And I always say your best bet is to contact your local or your local wildlife officer that works for the State Game and Fish Agency, and generally they will know the rules that you have to be aware of, both statewide, locally, and of course there's federal laws too. Also, if you have an animal control officer in your county, it never hurts to contact them and say, this is what I plan on doing. Do you know if this is legal, or do I need to get a permit from someone? Because in many cases, all that's necessary is a telephone call and an explanation of why you want to control this particular wildlife species, and you can get a permit quite easily as long as it's not an animal that's the population is in jeopardy. Public perceptions is something we need to be aware of. Just because we are working with people maybe that understand the need to remove or destroy this animal or to change habitat, that doesn't mean that the public is going to accept that. I work with a lot of golf courses, and it's amazing how the public perception becomes almost the #1 consideration when they're controlling wildlife. And we've had many situations where people have trouble with their neighbors because they want to control the ground squirrels that are tearing up their garden, and the neighbors feeding them because they're a pet. And so we have to understand that these conflicts or these different opinions can occur, and sometimes we can't address them, but by knowing that they exist, we can at least foresee some problems that might occur. Safety considerations are always there. You know, over and over we say follow label directions, and that's a very logical thing. And anybody that's used any restricted use pesticides know that that's a very important thing to follow those label directions, and we can't emphasize that enough. However, there's other safety considerations that we need to be aware of. Most animals bite. Many wildlife species carry fleas or ticks or something like that that might pose some kind of a human health risk. I don't like to go overboard making people afraid of wildlife or afraid of the possible diseases they can catch. But if you are dealing with an animal in a dry situation that's known to carry fleas, and you might have to have some concerns there, talk to them about spraying the area down with some kind of a flea killer before they pick up the animal. Often we tell people to take the animal as they catch it and put it into a plastic bag and spray some flea killer in there. So, you know, there's different things that can be done that are very logical. Certainly the idea of wearing rubber gloves when you're handling wildlife in some cases is overkill, but it certainly is a precaution that wouldn't hurt. And sometimes, for many people, the unpleasantness of handling an animal carcass is lessened if they do have some rubber gloves on, and those are available quite inexpensively at drugstores and many hardware stores. So, you know, that's always something, and I can't think or mention all the considerations that there are, but just so people understand that safety is very important. And understand there are secondary effects of wildlife control. The one that we always think of is that we may have an animal that is actually helping to keep a population down of other pests. And the ones we always think of course, is the swallows and the number of mosquitoes they eat, the swallows that are putting in mud nests under your eaves is not a very pleasant thing. But if we move them away, they're not going to be eating the mosquitoes in that area if they have to go someplace else. And that's just an example. There's many other ones that have interactions with other wildlife or insects that might be pests, and those can be the secondary effects. Other secondary effects can be quite aesthetic. There are some cities that have real problems with deer, and they end up doing various things to reduce the deer population, and then all of a sudden people are complaining that, you know, where's those deer? We used to enjoy seeing them around. So know that when you do some wildlife control, there can be secondary effects. And then one that I always like to remind people of is when they try to do something lethal, and then the animal dies in a place they can't retrieve it. The skunk under the house that somebody decided to destroy is a good example of a secondary effect that can be very unpleasant. One of the first things that we need to tactfully talk to people about is if they really have a problem. Quite often people will say, I've got some deer mice out in my garage and we're really afraid we're going to get hantavirus, and I want to find out what I need to do in order to get rid of them. Well, there's nothing wrong with controlling rodents in your garage, but to think that you have a very high likelihood of contracting hantavirus with it is fairly unlikely. Likewise, people will often think they have a problem because they have some birds that are in their garden But if the birds really aren't doing anything, is it really a problem? They're just thinking they might have a problem. And again, there's nothing wrong with thinking ahead, so you can implement some preventative controls, but talking them through whether they really have a problem. Generally, this becomes more important on large-scale operations. When someone is wanting to control ground squirrels in an alfalfa field, I usually tell them to go out there and put a cage up that the ground squirrels can't get in, and look and see if you can see a difference in the alfalfa that grows inside that cage where the ground squirrels can't get, with the alfalfa on the outside that the ground squirrels are feeding on. And this is really an economically reasonable thing to do, so that you're not spending a lot of money on controlling a particular wildlife species, and you're really not going to see economic benefits from doing it. So talk through this idea of whether the problem really exists. Whenever we do wildlife damage control, there is a list of things that you want to consider, the things that you want to see that you might be able to address in order to solve this particular problem. Habitat modification is certainly one of the first things that we want to look at, because if we modify the habitat, we can then solve the problem for a longer period of time. Habitat modification can be anything from thinning trees so that the birds don't want to roost in them so much, to mowing the grass down so that the voles don't come onto the lawn from the adjacent thicker grass areas, or even around gardens to remove the cover that maybe is allowing voles to get to the garden and cause some problems, and they don't like to go across these open areas. And so modifying the habitat can be one of the best ways to solve the problems. And every species, that should be the first thing we think of. Is there something we can do to make this area less attractive to them? Sometimes the cultural things that we need to look at can be the most important. I always consider, when people call with bat problems, you look at the architecture that we have, the beautiful Spanish tiles, which just provide absolutely great access for bats, places to stay, places to live, and they get crawling around up there and find a crack, and next thing they're in the attics. Certainly the feeding of wildlife is a cultural thing that we do that then ends up having real problems, because generally the animal has to be destroyed. You can't just take a bear that's gotten used to eating in garbage cans and take it out into a real remote area and think that it's not going to look around that area to see if it can find another place to get into the garbage. So that's one of the things that's very frustrating, when people don't help us nip these problems early on. People feeding deer, again, is one of the good-hearted things that they do, but not only is it bad because the deer start living in an area and getting used to people and then getting into shrubs and gardens, but it's really an unhealthy situation. When deer congregate like this, you see in the picture, they end up spreading diseases to each other. They develop nervous habits. There are behavioral things that start happening. The more dominant animals get the food, the subdominant animals don't get enough of it. And next thing you know, you have deer laying around dying because the bigger ones are eating more than their share. And there's just a number of situations where these good-hearted things have turned into real negative situations. Exclusion, quite often, is another solution that we can use to a wildlife problem. For every species, it almost seems like there's different things that we have to do. We're going to talk about fencing deer out. We're going to talk about bat problems that you might have and how you can keep them from being there. And then some of the ideas, things are even more creative, than people put up barriers to try to keep different kinds of rodents from getting from one place to another. And some of those are very species specific, and some of them are very general. Repellents, that seems like that's what people always want to do, especially people in urban areas. I want to just make them go away. I don't want to have to kill them or remove them or make them do something else. Well, believe me, the industry has taken advantage of this, and there's a whole pile of things that are sold to repel animals. And you'll hear me say several times throughout the presentation that this particular repellent in scientific experiments has not proven to be effective. because I never want to say this doesn't work, because then somebody's going to raise their hand and say, well, we put up this ultrasound device and next thing we knew, we didn't have any deer in our yard no more. And so I don't ever say it doesn't work. I just say that in scientific experiments, it hasn't been proven to be effective. And some of them do work good, and I'll talk about those, but some of them are just like fishing lures. It sounds good to the customer, and so they buy it. Frightening devices, again, there's a large variety of those. Most of them are temporary in nature. The animals eventually get used to them, but some of them can work for a lot longer period of time. But repellents, in some cases, are all we can do, especially when we're dealing with things like birds, or especially birds that are protected. We don't have an opportunity to do anything but try to scare them away. And see down the list here, it's quite a ways before we start talking about removing the animals. That's one of the things we consider quite a ways down the list, actually removing them. And there's several different things we can do to remove them. We can capture them alive and take them someplace else. We can use lethal traps to kill the animal to remove it. We can shoot them where that's safe and legal. That's an option to consider. We can use toxicants, again, where the proper permits exist and the situation makes that a thing to utilize. Keep in mind that we go through all these things and consider them. We're not saying that all of them can work in every situation, but we want to think through all this list first. And then there's some things that are very species specific. Some of those are the more fun ones, where you have a particular animal that you can use a control method on that you can't use for other animals. And we often find that that's a good thing to keep in mind when you're trying to address a problem with a specific animal. Some of the things that we do that are species specific can vary from packing snow down to keep voles from moving, to using lasers to frighten geese, to monofilament line to keep waterfowl out, and then other things you do for snakes and beavers that are just related to those kinds of animals. So species-specific ones can work. Now I need to talk for a moment about some of the considerations when you do catch an animal alive, and whether to release it or to transplant it. In our world today, generally people, if they can, they want to take an animal and turn it loose someplace else. And, on the surface, that sounds like, wow, that's exactly what we should be doing. Yeah, why kill the poor thing? Put him someplace where he can live better. You have to ask yourself, though, now today's science is that it might not really be humane to transplant an animal. What we do know through research is that when animals, and I'm talking generally, but when you think of things like skunks and squirrels and rabbits, and even larger things like bears, different things like that, we also need to consider this when we're talking about transplanting them. But we do know that 80% of the animals die of exposure, accidents, starvation, things like that. When you put them into an area, their first inclination is to get home. So that doesn't mean they find the closest cover and they stay there and live happily ever after. They're going to try to get home. And that's usually when they run into these problems of exposure, accidents, starvation, different things like that. Why do they try to get home? Well, for one thing, there's a natural tendency for them to stay in the area that they came from. But if you put them into some good habitat, the animals are already there. And the animals that are already there are going to drive away the newcomers. There's an automatic dominance over an animal that is established in an area over an animal that just comes into the area as a newcomer. So the resident animals will already try to drive them out of the good habitat. Okay? In the poor habitat, if you put them in there where there isn't any other animals, you have to ask yourself, well, why isn't there anything else here? And chances are it's because it's just not good habitat. It either doesn't provide the support that they need, or maybe there's no water, or maybe it's not thick enough cover, or maybe the cover's too thick, or maybe it's not big enough. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons that habitat is not going to be sufficient for a particular species. So you have to ask, is it really humane to transplant an animal? Now we also know that it's biologically risky to transplant nuisance animals. As we said before, they're likely to continue to be a nuisance. If you trap a skunk that has been getting into garbage and has been coming around homes and has gotten used to people, likely they're going to look for that situation again. You can take them a long ways away, and so they might not get back to the place they came from. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be a problem for someone else. And this is one of the considerations we have when we are dealing with transplanting bears, which I'm sure most of you people won't be involved with, but you will likely have clientele that have to get a hold of the agency in charge of transplanting bears. And this is a problem that we continually run into when we take something like a bear. It's used to people, it gets used to utilizing what people can provide, and then take them someplace else to an area where people might not be forewarned or might not even expect that problem to exist. And in comes a bear that's really not very afraid of people. So that's one of the things we worry about when they're likely to become a nuisance. We also know that animals do spread diseases. You take an animal from one place where there may be some resistance to a particular disease, and you can move it someplace else and cause that to be spread amongst animals that don't have that resistance, or that the disease doesn't even exist there. So that's a problem. But there's even a finer concern, and that is that of gene contamination. It doesn't take a lot of generations before animals in a particular habitat area are selected to live under those conditions. Selected to resist the predators that might be in the area, selected to survive during a difficult winter with maybe a minimal amount of cover. And all of a sudden you put other animals in there that don't have that selection, don't have that gene combination, and you're actually hurting that population if any interbreeding does come about. All of this is really a reason why the Wildlife Society, which is the National Organization of Professional Wildlife Biologists, a few years back wrote a white paper to address this. And it was very difficult to get everyone to agree. But basically, we found out that when legal to do so, euthanasia may be the most humane and biologically sound decision. If that animal is euthanized, it might be the most humane thing to do, and it might be the most biologically sound thing to do. I spent time talking about this just so that people kind of keep that in the back of their mind, and it still does not address the fact that some people just feel bad about killing an animal that they could turn loose. And so I'm not really saying that it's wrong to turn these animals loose. I'm just saying make people aware of these considerations, then have them make the decision of whether to release it or whether to euthanize it. Okay, when we look at problems on wildlife that I'm certainly not going to be able to cover today, I mean, there's university classes that are taught. There are books, handbooks, large notebooks to cover all the different species and all the different considerations. One of the best places to get this information for county extension educators and RCS personnel is the eExtension webpage. This is the address for the eExtension webpage where there is this information I was talking about that the wildlife specialists across the country put together many years ago. The first one I think was in 1994, and then it's been updated since then and then put into electronic formats and added to and deleted, but it's really pretty up to date and very complete. And the main thing is it includes a lot of information about the biology of the animal, the life history, the reproduction things, and all those things that quite often can trigger information that might help you better prevent or control wildlife damage that's occurring.